Hi guys, it's Mr. Y. Today we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. I didn't put a title here, so let's fix that. Photosynthesis. Now, just like with cell respiration, you can see there's going to be links in the description. They're here on the page if you need to copy them down, but I'll try to put as many active ones as I can in the description down below this video. So by all means, pause the video, go watch these animations. They should help explain parts that I can't show with just pictures. Makes things a lot easier to understand. So make sure you watch them as much as you need to. Alright, so photosynthesis takes place usually on the leaves of the plants. That should be obvious. Leaves usually come out during the springtime, of course, and bloom and get nice and big and green for the summertime, and then will change colors in the autumn and fall off in the wintertime. Now, the basics of photosynthesis you should have learned in middle school, which is you put in sunlight, get in some carbon dioxide and a little bit of water, and you get out oxygen. Now, if they really did their job, they should have also told you the plant makes its own food. Now, for food, we're just going to insert either glucose or sucrose, both of which are sugars, so that is the food the plant is producing for itself. So when you were in 8th grade taking physical science, you should have learned that light comes in many different wavelengths. It has many different lengths, and the visible color spectrum ranges about 400 to 700, the light that we can actually see. There is other lights that we can't see in the infrared and the ultraviolet, but usually the stuff we can see is between here at 400 nanometers to here to 700 nanometers in wavelength. You can see this gives you the full color spectrum, and you can actually break natural sunlight up by running it through a prism to see this. And then if you were to take a bunch of prisms and then splice them together in circles, you get this nice little pretty effect over here where you can see all the colors of sunlight. Now, this is important because not all sunlight is equal in the needs of a plant. So you can see here on this graph to my left, this is the rate of photosynthesis, this line here, and it goes up, spike down a little bit, spikes there, drops, and then comes back up for another spike, and then drops again. And you can see you have wavelength here, and then again you have a range of about 400 to about 700 nanometers. And they've also color-coded the graph so you can see that certain light actually works better for photosynthesis, for the rate of photosynthesis to happen. And you can see here, the violets, the ultraviolets, the blues, those work pretty good. And then the reds here work really good until you get into about the infrared. But what really doesn't work good is right here, this section. Greens and yellow greens. So right about there you see the lowest rate of photosynthesis. That means green light is actually the worst for the photosynthetic reactions to happen. So green light typically gets reflected by plants. This is why plants look green. The red and blue, violet all get absorbed and used for the process of photosynthesis, and we see the plants as is green to our eyes because that's the light that actually gets reflected to our eyes, especially where the plant is doing photosynthesis in the leaves, namely. So inside of a plant cell, and there's a great animation, I want to say it might be the last one, there's a great walkthrough that shows you the zoom in of a plant cell, but you can see this picture on page 97 of your textbook. We are talking about a specific organelle called the chloroplast. Now, we should have covered this when we went over the organelles, and the chloroplast is a very special organelle. Like the mitochondria, it actually has two layers surrounding it, 1, 2 here. And then it actually has its own ribosomes, its own DNA, which is unique for most organelles with the exception of the mitochondria. Inside of the chloroplast is this little fluid stuff called the stroma, this space here. Again, you have the inner and outer membranes. And then you have these stacks of these things called thylakoids. Thylakoids are basically these little guys right here that look like flat green pancakes, and a whole stack of them is called a granum. And you can see in this top picture that the sunlight comes in, again, gets filtered out, the red, the blues, the violets gets absorbed for photosynthesis, and what gets transmitted out, what can pass through or be reflected off, is green light. Let's just label that green. And so that's what we see plants as. Here's an actual picture of a microscopic image of various plant cells. You can see these little green images. So this here is the whole cell right here with the cell wall. These little guys are the chloroplasts. You see they are highly concentrated in green color here, and then of course here, 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 here. Those are the chloroplasts. So usually what we're seeing in terms of the green color is just billions upon billions upon billions of chloroplasts all reflecting green light, or letting the green light pass through while absorbing the red, the blues, the violets. Again, this is just another picture of the chloroplasts. You can see the granums, the stacks of thylakoids that look like I said, green pancakes, and then you can see the inner and the outer layers of the membrane of the chloroplast, and again you can see a true microscopic image there. Okay, so the overall reaction as it stands probably to your minds, as you learned it in middle school, again, is just carbon dioxide with some water and energy. Now the energy comes, as I said before, from sunlight, and the energy packets that sunlight actually delivers are called photons. So when we talk about photons, think sunlight. So photons, sunlight. And what you get out of the reaction is you get oxygen, and the plant gets sugars. Again, we could be calling them glucose or sucrose. Just sugars is the general term for that, and that would be considered the plant's food. Again, you can see this in a much more mathematical equation down here. And the true equations work like this. You take about 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water molecules for every 2 photons. You get out 1 molecule of oxygen and about 6 molecules of, well, I labeled the chemical formula in this case glucose. Sometimes they'll say sucrose. It's always going to be a sugar of some form. Notice this is actually the reverse of cell respiration. The only difference is the change in energy items. So with respiration, you put in oxygen and sugars from food, you get out carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP. That's our energy molecule. Here in photosynthesis, again, you're putting in carbon dioxide, water, and energy, this time as photons, and now you're getting out oxygen and sugar molecules. Again, could be considered glucose or sucrose or fructose. So really these equations are actually the same equation. They are just the reverse of each other in a true retrospective view of it. So remember that plants actually can do both photosynthesis and cell respirations. Animals, we can only do cell respiration, but plants actually can not only produce their own food, then they can digest their own food to make ATP. So keep in mind, plants have mitochondria and chloroplasts, whereas animals only have mitochondria to do cell respiration. So in the last lecture, I made you copy down a really complex diagram showing you the stages, the 3 stages of cell respiration. I'm going to do the same with this lecture. Let me get a label on here. I would like you to pause the video and copy down this diagram in its entirety to the best of your abilities. Copy down, this is the chloroplast, so get the whole edge, the inner edge, and then get what's going in here, here, and then what's coming out of each stages, because you basically have 2 stages. You have one stage here and a second stage over here. Now, both stages of photosynthesis happen inside the chloroplast, just in slightly different parts of the chloroplast. So we're going to be talking about the first stage, what's often called the light reactions, in just a minute. The light reactions, as you can see in this diagram, and this is why I like it, shows you it needs light, obviously. That's why it's called the light reactions. It also needs water, which is coming in here from the outside, probably from the roots of the plants. It's also going to need some electron carriers. Now remember, with cell respiration, we had electron carriers that were called NAD. Here it's the same thing, they just added a little phosphate to them, so it's NADP. And when they come out of the light reactions, they're going to be full of electrons, so they'll be called NADPH. That's the full version when they have electrons. ADP, that's the spent energy of the cell. You're going to take a phosphate with that, and you're going to make it into ATP. That's the cash you can spend for work. So NADP and ADP both go in, so you have 4 items going in. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you get at least 3 items coming out. First and foremost, oxygen. Oxygen exits the entire reaction at this point. Your full electron carriers and your ATP, which will then go on to stage 2, which we'll talk about in a few more slides. All right, so stage 1, the light-dependent reactions, sometimes they're just called the light reactions. This is happening inside the thylakoids themselves. Again, you're going to need 2 photons for this, 2 packets of light energy, some water, preferably from the plant's roots, and your empty electron carriers and some empty energy packets called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Those go in, and like I said before, what comes out? Oxygen, some full electron carriers, and some ATP. Notice the oxygen probably came from splitting apart the water molecule in this case. So a way to think of the light reactions is with this picture. I like this picture a lot because it kind of just breaks down the basic principles of the light reaction. Of course, you need light, and as I said, light comes in the form of photons, which you can see this worker down here using this big mallet for. Photons will strike the surface of what we call a photosystem, and the order of these things is kind of backwards, and it's backwards because they were named in the order in which they were discovered. So photosystem 1 was actually discovered by scientists first, then later on they discovered photosystem 2. So it seems backwards, but that's just the way they discovered them. So a photon will strike the surface of the plant. It will actually cause an electron to become, for lack of a better word, excited, to have a higher energy state. So they represent that by showing this little mallet guy hitting this lever and then helping to raise the energy state of the electron up here. And the electron is hyper-energized and it has to let off that energy. And if you can channel that, you can actually use that excess energy to make ATP. And you'll recall in cellular respiration, I talked about ATP synthase working like a water wheel, and they actually kind of show it here, again, kind of working like a water wheel to make ATP. Then you can see a second photon being used right here. Here's the second photon being used to re-energize this electron back up to another photosystem, photosystem 1 in this case, until it's passed on to its final acceptor, which is NADPH now, because now it's carrying the electrons. Before it was just, remember, NAD, big A, DP plus. So 2 photons, 1, 2. You have 2 photosystems. It goes photosystem 2, then photosystem 1, and then you end with the electron being carried away by NADPH. So that ends the light reactions. Again, it seems complicated, but really the basic principles are fine. There's a couple good animations in the links in the description that you should watch for those. So I'm going to move on then to the second step. So we're done with this. We're going to move on to stage 2 over here. This is happening inside the stroma. Again, the ATP we've made from stage 1 from the light reactions, and the NADPH, the electron carriers, are going to help power stage 2, which is typically called the Calvin cycle. It's also known as the dark reactions. That doesn't mean it happens at night. It just means it doesn't need sunlight to work. So it can happen during the day or it can happen at night. The light reactions can only happen during the daytime. At day. Whereas these guys over here, the Calvin cycle, can happen anytime. Night or day. They are light independent, really, is what they should be named. And then you can see, as I said, we're getting ATP, NADPH, and we're also going to have an extra ingredient, an infusion of carbon dioxide to make this process go. And then at the end, the ATP is going to be used up, the NADP is going to be emptied of its electrons, and at some point we're going to get out something resembling a sugar molecule, either glucose or sucrose. Okay, so like I said, Calvin cycle can also be called the dark reactions. The ATP and the electron carriers eventually make it to the stroma of the chloroplast, that's the space of the chloroplast. and we get an infusion of carbon dioxide into the chloroplast as well, and then out comes sugars, again, examples, glucose, sucrose. The electrons get used up, and the energy from ATP also gets used up. Now, I call this the Calvin cycle. Some textbooks might call it the citric acid cycle. Be aware, they are the same thing. It really just depends on the textbook. So Calvin cycle is, again, it's named after the scientist who discovered it, just like the Krebs cycle from cell respiration. So the citric acid cycle, it is the same thing as the Calvin cycle. So here is an actual rendering. There's a figure of page 212 of your textbook that shows something similar to this. It shows, again, that nice diagram you copied down and what point they're emphasizing. You have 3 carbon dioxides going into the cycle, and they're basically stringing these things up into different variations of carbon chains. They're using the energy to power of ATP to power this system along. They're using the energy from the electron carriers as well. And at the end, you get this weird, ugly little chain called glycidiroid 3-phosphate, or G3P. That's what comes out in reality. It is a basic skeletal structure of a sugar compound. And then this cycle continues on, and then you go for 3 more carbon dioxides to get another G3P. So the Calvin cycle, again, also called the dark reactions, takes a total of 6 carbon dioxide molecules, gets rid of the oxygens in the carbon dioxide molecules, and strings them up to form 2 G3P molecules. And again, it uses the energy from ATP, once it's emptied, it's ADP, and the electrons from the electron carriers, which are now NADP plus again, to make this reaction work. And then you can take these G3P carbon chains, string them together to make something like glucose or sucrose. So it gets complex, but don't let it scare you. It's just different ways of stringing up carbon molecules to make sugar molecules again. Remember, glucose always has 6 sugars, or 6 carbons, excuse me. Yeah. So the photosynthesis reaction produces sugar molecules. Again, here's the G3P stuff. And you can get either sucrose or glucose. And the glucose, as I said before, can actually then be used by that same cell in its mitochondria to process cellular respiration, to produce even more ATP. This was the cell respiration. So these reactions actually start to play into each other. First, photosynthesis, taking carbon dioxide, water, and photons to actually produce your own food, and then using that food to make a whole bunch of ATP in cellular respiration. And I like this picture because it shows you the similarities between the mitochondria and the chloroplast. Again, remember very back way in the beginning when I talked about cell theory, we said the mitochondria and chloroplasts are unique in that they each have their own DNA. They can actually replicate. They can self-replicate inside the cell. What also makes them unique is they both have electron transport chain systems set up, and they both use ATP synthase. Again, some of the animations in the description will show you this process in action for the electron transport chain, for the light reactions, and the ATP synthase for the light reactions. So they both use the same basic principles, which is why many scientists tend to think they were originally an independent form of bacteria that were absorbed by larger cells and then not actually digested as a form of symbiosis. In any case, the sugar made from the chloroplast is what supplies the entire plant with the chemical energy, ATP, eventually, once it's gone through cellular respiration, and any G3P it needs to synthesize sugar molecules. So about 50% of the organic material is actually consumed for fuel for cell respiration. So about 50% of the sugars made go to cellular respiration. The carbohydrates in the forms of disaccharide sucrose travel via the plant's veins to its non-photosynthetic cells, i.e. cells that are underground that don't have access to sunlight, or cells that are too far into the plant. So if we're talking about a tree, cells that don't have access to the sunlight, that are closer to the center of the tree, those plants have to be able to get sugars as well, so they actually get it shipped in from the outer surface of the leaves. And once it's there, it provides the fuel for respiration for the cells, of course, and includes the raw materials for building of new cells, for building of new proteins, new lipids, and any extracellular polysaccharide cellulose, i.e. cell wall, so the plant can actually grow and stay standing vertically. So photosynthesis is a very important reaction, highly important. You cannot underestimate its importance, in fact. Most of the excess sugar that plants actually make is stored as starch. We talked about starch as a carbohydrate back in biochemistry. And in certain plants, they store a lot in their roots, such as potatoes or tubers. Seeds, of course, will store lots of starch, and of course, fruits store lots of different sugars, fructose, and lots of carbohydrates. Heterotrophs, that means anything that eats other animals, so heterotrophs, including humans, like ourselves, of course, may partially or entirely consume the plant for fuel or raw materials. And on a global scale, photosynthesis is, by and large, the most important chemical reaction you will ever study. Each year, it's thought, and this is probably an underestimate, that photosynthesis produces 175 billion tons of carbohydrates. Again, that's feeding not just humans, but any type of animal that eats those plants. So photosynthesis is essential for all life on Earth, with the exception of those who don't actually have access to sunlight, or to plants that have access to sunlight. Okay guys, make sure you check out the links in the description below, the ones that look like this. Watch all the animations, watch them as many times as you need to, so you understand the basics of what's going on. Don't worry about the details of the different photosystems, or the details particularly of the Calvin cycle. I'm not really interested in testing you guys on that stuff. I'm more interested in testing you guys on knowing what goes into each reaction, what goes into the light reaction, and what goes into the Calvin cycle, and then what comes out of each reaction, and how certain things like NADP plus and NADPH can be cycled between the two stages, and where each stage happens. So make sure you ask questions in class if you need help, and again, check out the links below. Have a good day.